Hi everybody, I'm Simon Tanner. I'm the Head of Department for Digital Humanities at King's College London, and I'm really pleased to be here to talk to you and to meet with you. Kate's talk is a hard one to follow, but we'll see what we can do. I have to say, it's in this situation, I'm reminded very much with the sort of asking Elliot to do the clicking. I was at a European conference, and I had to follow the keynote speaker, and the keynote speaker stood up and sort of strode about the stage in that sort of rock star sort of mode, you know, had his lovely assistant to the side who was pressing the button, and his way of signalling that she, inevitably, this is a middle-aged white man and a she, and his way of signaling this was he'd walk around and he'd just go, and he did 250 slides in 20 minutes. It was probably the most egregious piece of stage sexism I've ever seen in my life. Made my talk really easy because everyone hated him. So that was great, you know. So I have to say I'm in a much easier situation here, or a much harder situation actually, following such a fascinating talk from Kate. And I have to say there's a whole bunch of connections between what Kate's doing and what we're doing at King's. And I'd also say we're very, very lucky. We have a program at King's where one of the members of staff at Pearson is on my master's course and is my dissertation student. So I'm very pleased that we've got those links with Pearson. So if we go to the next slide, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about digital humanities at King's. I'm going to talk to you about digital and research. So one of the things I'd probably be worth stating right up front is that although we are a very good department of digital humanities with a very strong research program, we actually have a teaching program, but what we don't do is very innovative in that teaching program with regard to the use of digital tools. And in many ways, we need to be learning from people like Pearson about how we can be more innovative in those digital tools. So we have a BA in digital culture, which is kicking off next year, and we're recruiting at the moment. We have 4 masters, a master's in digital asset and media management, a master's in digital humanities, a master's in digital culture and society, and an international master's in digital curation. We have an active PhD program that's been running for the last 7 years, and is quite an innovative PhD program because we work in that PhD program with other departments in the School of Arts and Humanities, so that students can come and do a PhD in digital humanities and history, or in philosophy and digital humanities, so that they don't have to sort of wander out into the big wide world and go, look, I've got a PhD in digital humanities, and everyone goes, I don't get that. You're coming to ask for a job at a history department? You know, so it helps people to keep their subject focus within their activity of digital humanities. Because the point here is that digital humanities is about this application of digital technologies to humanities, disciplines and questions, and I'll explain more about this in a moment. It's also about a reflection upon the impact of the digital domain upon humanity. I mean, what does it mean for us? How do we affect the digital environment? How does the digital environment affect us? And along those areas. These are just measures of scale. I'm not trying to put these up here to give you the impression that we're important. I want you to take them on board in terms of we have a lot of research. We know. You look at £2 million of research income per annum. That's not a great amount of research if you're a biomed school, but in a School of Arts and Humanities in the UK, that's a lot of income in research, and we generate and support an awful lot of income across the School of Arts and Humanities, working in collaboration with departments of history, English, theology, music, etc., etc., etc. You can imagine those relationships. It does mean that we have created some interesting challenges for ourselves. One of those being that we have well over 100 projects, legacy projects, that we have worked on over many years, which have now over 5 million digital objects, which are all freely available, open access. you can access them and engage with them online, but we have to look after them. We have to manage them. We have to curate them. We are, if you like, an academic department which in some ways has many similarities to a publisher, a memory organisation like a library or an archive. And that actually brings a whole bunch of challenges with it because we're an academic department. This is not our mission. It's something we have found ourselves in the situation of having to resolve with. And the other thing there at the bottom is just to point out that you may think that, and a little bit in contradiction of Elliot's point about entertainment here, we may think that what we're doing is very deep intellectual research projects which have deep intellectual research outcomes, and then we put them and make them available on the web, and suddenly we find that we have several tens of millions of users coming in and using those resources in ways which in many ways is about lifelong learning, but also is about just entertainment. It's about them finding something entertaining, diverting, interesting in their lives. And so for me, entertainment actually is a factor here that we should at least consider. So what I'd like to do next, if you can just go to the next slide, and in a moment I'll ask you to click the middle, is one of our PhD students, and you're PhD students, so you should be quite intrigued by this, won a competition to explain his PhD in 2 minutes, and got PhD Comics to animate it. And in many ways this really does talk about what is digital humanities in terms of the essence of how it works, etc. And hopefully all the technology will work, that speaker will burst into life, and we'll get an interesting thing.
Can you describe your thesis in 2 minutes?
Most people think historians spend all their time in the library reading books, and you wouldn't be far off. But recently, the library has gotten too big, way too big, and it's getting bigger at an alarming rate. That's because billions of records have been digitized and are now online. Historians are faced with far more material than they could ever hope to read in a lifetime, or even 100 lifetimes. My research looks at a pretty typical historical question. How were Irish immigrants to London, England treated at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution? But instead of heading to the library, I'm heading to my computer to apply some of the best tricks of computer science to the task, namely distant reading. Distant reading basically means figuring out what something says without actually reading it. It's the type of classifying that Google does to help you find a recipe for an apple pie. Google hasn't read those web pages. Instead, they've created a computer program that does it for them. I'm doing the same thing, but instead of focusing on pies, I'm asking questions like, which documents refer to Irish people? Like Google, I've developed a set of computerized tests to determine if a document is relevant or if it's not. That automation is crucial when you're dealing with databases containing hundreds of millions of words of text. But finding relevant material isn't all we can do in the age of the internet. Computers have also allowed me to measure aspects of 19th century life in which the Irish experience differed from that of a typical Londoner. For example, I can tell you that an Irish person was roughly 4 times more likely than an English counterpart to appear in a London court on trial for his or her life. There's no way we would ever have found that out without distant reading. We live in a world in which information is overabundant, and managing it effectively can mean the difference between finding what you're after and getting lost in a jungle of data. There's too much to read out there, so it's time we found another way to do it. My name is Adam Crimble. I'm a student at King's College London in the United Kingdom, and the title of my thesis is Understanding the London Irish Immigrant Experience Through Large-Scale Textual Analysis, 1801 to 1820.
So Adam really eloquently summed up in many ways the idea of digital humanities, which is how can we ask a research question in a way that we would find really difficult to do if there wasn't a digital environment in which to ask it. Now his asking of that question, the use of distant reading as a method of finding out information was predicated on a number of things. One of them was that a whole bunch of that information was digitally available, and so the Old Bailey session papers, which is my example here, that being a digitally available resource was key to him being able to ask some of those research questions. Then it being created in such a way that he could use systems and mechanisms to interrogate that resource rather than having to go through someone else's interface. He could actually just go and interrogate the resource directly with his own tools. So there's all of those sorts of expectations that we have which allow us to get to that point of asking interesting research questions. And from my perspective as an academic, when I look at PhDs or I look at research, the thing that I find most interesting and most important is the quality of the research question. If you've got a good research question, then we can start looking at methods to engage with that research question. We can look at ways in which resources can be put together to look at that research question. So what Digital Humanities doesn't do is stop you from having to come up with a great research question. You've still got to do that. It doesn't get, there isn't a shortcut here which is, oh, because we're doing things in digital, we can ignore a lot of the scholarship that goes into thinking about it. You're still going to have to do all that background reading, still going to have to do that literature review to understand the subject well enough to come up with an interesting and useful research question. What Digital Humanities and digital tools can do is enable you not to have to spend 15 or 20 years delving through court transcripts to come up with that simple outcome, because that's not the whole outcome of Adam's PhD, that Irish immigrants are 4 times more likely to be in court in the way that he expressed it. So it enables you to maybe ask questions that would have just been unfeasible previously because you don't have time or you don't have the resources to answer them in other ways. So it opens up research questions that maybe we would have thought, this is a great question, but I just can't answer it because there's no way for me to engage with that. It enables English scholars, for instance, who may have been realizing that there's no way that they can engage with the tens of thousands of 19th century novels that are out there, and would previously have maybe focused on somewhere between 400 and 4,000 novels as being the only things they ever really looked at. It enables them to maybe think, are there things that I can do here where I can actually engage with all of the novels that exist? If I want to ask questions about the way that religion is expressed in 19th century novels, or maybe I want to ask questions about the way that grammar and punctuation is used in those novels, so we can get at that from a English perspective, or we can get it from a corpus linguistic perspective. So new questions, and as Tim Hitchcock said about the Old Bailey, it reaches out to communities. So there was an aspect here of being able to make a resource available to the public, which enabled public engagement, but also helped with this refactoring of history in terms of his reconfiguring where he wants to see history being studied as a sort of history from below, rather than history always being looked at from the elite's perspective who left records. We can look at history from below, as expressed by Dr. David Turner. He is talking about digitized resources, enabling him to ask questions about the lives of disabled people that he would have felt disabled from himself asking because of the nature of the materials that would have previously been left or available to him. And so the ability to use the digital to ask new questions, the ability to use digital humanities conceptions to cross disciplinary boundaries with different tools enables us to ask new questions that we maybe thought were difficult to ask before. Next slide, please. And also there's that aspect of bringing resources together. If we can bring resources together, maybe we can study them in ways that we previously couldn't. And one of the effects of the digital humanities, I wouldn't say this is necessarily the intention, but the effect of the digital humanities is to make a lot of educational resources actually available. So the Jane Austen fiction manuscripts digital edition is one of our favourite projects at King's. I was involved with the Old Bailey right at the beginning. I designed the metadata schema and the character capture for that project. And the Jane Austen fiction manuscripts is a project where we're working with Catherine Sutherland, who's a world expert in Jane Austen at Oxford University. And as Catherine says, it offers an unprecedented opportunity for new scholarship, particularly in exploring the creative laboratory of her novels. So far an under-examined area of Austen studies, also making the manuscript sources freely available. You can talk about early English books online, which enables someone to see resources without having to travel to all the different libraries that hold those resources in the world. And you can see here, this is an image from one of those Jane Austen manuscripts. One of the key outcomes of this project actually was, if you click the next slide, was a better public understanding of what it is to be a creative writer. Because a lot of people assumed that Jane Austen just wrote perfectly, that her grammar was wonderful, that her punctuation was perfect, and that no one else was involved in this process. It was just her. And of course, what you see when you get involved with the manuscripts is, as she was sending off manuscripts to the editor, that in some respects, when you look at the end book, the book that we now study and say, this is Pride and Prejudice, this is the wonderful book here, are quite different from what that book actually ended up, because editors have a role. They actually are involved in the creative process. And actually, in some ways, this is quite enabling, because one of the things that can be a problem is this assumption that if you're a great creative person, you did that on your own and no one else helped you. And actually understanding that creativity is something that is always a team activity. In almost all examples, someone else is involved. Even if all they're doing is making the tea and giving you a biscuit and pat on the back and saying, keep going, you know, there is always other people involved. But particularly in literature, music, art, film, there's always a team there, and it's always worth being able to express that. And those sorts of things come out. So next slide, please. It's also about maybe bringing collections out of the dark, collections that would not normally be seen. This is a project called the Digital Image Archive of Medieval Music, where we have funding from the Andrew Mellon Foundation to travel the world taking images of music manuscripts which would otherwise be in great danger of dying. These are not the pretty manuscripts that will automatically get imaged. These are the ones that are difficult to do. This one's been eaten by rodents. That one was found lining a hat box. It was being used to line a hat box, so is an accidental bit of preservation there. Next slide, please. This image here is an image from a music manuscript. Now we can hand this image to musicologists. We can give them this with some simple tools. What's happened here is that the ink, acid was used in the ink at that time. It's eaten through from one side of the page to the other. And if we click again, with a simple tool, a musicologist, someone who's an expert, can reveal what the notes on this side of the page should be, and we can present both of those as outcomes. And so, you know, a lot of this is about enabling us to see things, enabling us to engage with new research perspectives. Next slide, please. But at the end of the day, we're not replacing traditional scholarship with a whole new transformational scholarship that hasn't existed. These are the sorts of scholarly activities that John Unsworth discussed in his paper called Scholarly Primitives. And there are probably other segments that one could think about in those areas. But what I find interesting here is the idea that this is what scholars do. We discover, we annotate, we compare, we refer, we sample, we illustrate, we represent. These are the things that scholars do. What I find really interesting is that you could take out that middle section of scholars and put in web users. And you'd find that all of these words would still be true. And in some ways, what we're really trying to do is sort of connect some of those relationships together in enabling research which actually reflects very much what all of us as lifelong learners are doing out there in the digital world, with the very deep, intense research that is being done by arts and humanities scholars in any perspective, and thinking, you know, for each of these segments, where can the digital humanities act as a enabler? Where can the digital humanities act as a catalyst? Maybe breaking down some subject boundaries so that we're not having to always come at this from only one perspective. We can start to enable historians and theologists to work together in a really innovative way, just in the same way that to a certain extent, chaos theory has enabled scientists to say, look, physicists and geologists, you've got something to say to each other. chemists and meteorologists, you've got something to say to each other. What digital humanities is maybe doing is not as grand as chaos theory in any sense, but is having a similar catalytic aspect of enabling different subjects to talk to each other in ways they may not have been able to do previously. So my next slide, please. What I'd like to do just for the last couple of minutes is just finish talking about my research, the thing that I'm really interested and passionate about. And so I'm really interested in the idea of how do we trade, how do we find value, what is impact in the digital domain. And I've done research which has looked into research and scholarship, the value and benefits of digitized resources for learning, teaching, research and enjoyment. I'm putting that enjoyment word right out there. And one of the things that we discovered in this research was that the UK has spent over £100 million over the last 15 years on digitizing content. But we don't really know what difference it's been making to people. We don't really know what effect it's been having. And what we could see is a lot of assertion, but not necessarily a huge amount of evidence. I mean, I think Kate's paper was really on point about those aspects. How do we demonstrate that what we're doing is making a difference? And this led me into my current research interest. Next slide, please, which is looking at measuring the impact of digitized resources and my development of the balanced value impact model. Next slide, please. And you'll see some very strong synergies here. So what I thought was there's a real problem here, which is that culture and heritage, memory organizations, education organizations are really bad at digitizing content, making digital content available, and then knowing whether it's actually made a difference to anyone. We tend to measure things by saying, oh, we've made 200,000 images available. We have governments which do things like put key performance indicators on a museum that I know of, where they've said your key performance indicator next year is to make 80,000 images available. It doesn't even say they have to be different images. So it doesn't say they have to be good images. Where does that sort of numbering actually help? When we talk about the Codex Sinaiticus from the British Library being accessed 20 million times, how actually significant is that? What does it mean? What does it actually do? And we talk about here the measurable outcomes arising from the existence of digital resource that demonstrate a change in the life or life opportunities of the community. And that goes well beyond this sort of output monitoring, where in a sense many of these projects are really only engaging with one client, and that's the funder. If the funder's happy, then we've achieved it. Not actually if there's an audience of students who are happy. In that sense, and so it's moving beyond that. Next slide, please. And so I have a model which thinks about perspectives of impact in terms of economic, social, internal innovation impact, and then thinks about various ways we might put values against those aspects so that we can create a mechanism for measuring. This is freely available on the web. There's about 60 pages of methods that you can dip into and come up with lots of different ways of thinking about how you do these sorts of measurements. So this is available to you. Next slide, please. And we're just about to start another research project as well. So in collaboration with the University College London Centre for Publishing and the Research Information Network, we have just won, we haven't even put out the press release yet, we've just won from the Arts Humanities Research Council and from the British Library our bid to enable us to explore the academic book of the future and to engage with that through communities of practice, to start to ask some key questions, to examine the role and purpose of the academic book to serve scholarship and wider learning, to facilitate, capture and analyse the working relationships of researchers, publishers and other stakeholders to the academic book, and to investigate and assess the opportunities and challenges associated with technological developments for the academic books. In some ways, coming back to the very first thing that Elliot was talking about, when you read something on a screen, is that actually an effective way to learn? Is content the way that drives that? Is actually a book an effective way of doing academic communication? Are we in a situation where actually, this model of a 200-page, 80,000-word book is based on that's what we used to be able to afford to create. And in some respects, some of those academic books will be better off as being a 30 or 40,000 page, 30 or 40,000 word book, and the rest is padding to fill out the expectation of the publisher that they will have a book of 200 pages of 80,000 words. The central idea could be conveyed much more briefly. So what is the meaning of long form writing to the academic community? And this is something we'll be exploring over the next 2 years and engaging with a number of, we want to engage with as many stakeholders and the community as possible to drive that project forward. So what I hope I've done, next slide please, is just really give you a snapshot of what does a Department of Digital Humanities do, what does the research perspective of Digital Humanities deliver, why that research perspective is not the same as innovative teaching, and just to be clear about that innovative teaching is something that we are striving to do, but actually I don't think we're any more advanced in the digital humanities than anyone else is on that structure, on that front, and why these sorts of resources, these sorts of opportunities can be powerful research opportunities for you as academics and in your academic futures. Thank you very much.